So yeah, this is a crucial sentence or part of the reading here for sure. He says that the crucial phases of this control seem to be two. First, the ability, either through personal gain, blah, 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 most importantly nowadays, through institutions, to prevent access by others to the object controlled, which is to say the means of production and the goods produced by them. You have the police, the courts, the armed forces, the institutions that prevent access. And then, on the other hand, you have the preferential treatment in the distribution of the products of those objects controlled, which would be the means of production, right? So who gets to benefit from the distribution of those products? Where there is such a controlling group in society, a group which, as against the rest of society, has a greater measure of control over the access to the instruments of production and a preferential treatment in the distribution of the products of those instruments, we may speak of this group as the socially dominant or ruling class in that society. It is hard indeed to see what else could be meant by dominant or ruling class. Such a group has the power and privilege and wealth in the society as against the remainder of society. It will be noted that this definition of a ruling class does not presuppose any particular kind of government or any particular legal form of property right. It rests upon the facts of control of access and preferential treatment and can be investigated empirically. It may also be observed that the two chief factors in control of access and preferential treatment and distribution, are closely related to in practice. Over any period of time, those who control access not unnaturally grant themselves preferential treatment in distribution. Just think of like the Pelosi family being worth over $100 million. Okay. Are the Pelosi's capitalists? No. They're representatives in a society. But why are they worth $100 million? Right? Well, because obviously if they have some part in deciding who gets to benefit from the distribution of goods in society, then they're going to cut themselves in on the deal. Just like all the senators who found out about COVID ahead of time and then changed their investment strategies so that they got rich off of it. Yeah, over any period of time, those who control access naturally grant themselves preferential treatment in distribution. And contending groups trying to alter the relations of distribution can accomplish this only by getting control of access. In fact, since differences in distribution income are much easier to study than relations of control, those differences are usually the plainest evidence we have for discovering the relations of control. Put more simply, the easiest way to discover what the ruling group is in any society is usually to see what group gets the biggest incomes. Everyone knows this, but it is still necessary to make the analysis because of the fact that control of access is not the same thing as preferential treatment in income distribution. The group that has one also normally has the other. That is the general historical law. But for brief periods, this need not invariably be the case, and we shall see later how significant the distinction is at the present time, right? And kind of where that's going, obviously, is that there's been a sort of split between ownership and control, between ownership and management. A lot of big monopoly capitalist families are mainly worrying about who's going to inherit what. You know, they do annual meetings and decide to make their money go in a different direction than it was going. But these things are based in the recommendations from the people who are managing their money, right? It's like if you think about the show Billions, Bobby Axelrod, you might think of him as a capitalist. He's obviously got to think about his capital investments, and his team at the hedge fund are always trying to make the numbers go up. But who do they work for? They work for the owners of that capital. Bobby Axelrod is not the owner of all that capital. He has to come on his hands and knees to those owners. Okay. He's in no way that Henry Ford character. You know, he did not oversee every aspect of the development of a factory and a brand. No, he's a manager of other people's money. In feudal society, by far the major instrument of production was the land. Feudal economy was overwhelmingly agriculture. De facto control of the land, with important restrictions and preferential treatment in the distribution of its products, were in the hands of the feudal lords, including the lords of the church, not, of course, as capitalist landlords, but through the peculiar institutions of feudal property rights. These lords, therefore, constituted the ruling class in feudal society. So long as agriculture remained the chief sector of economy, and so long as society upheld the feudal property rights, the lords remained the ruling class. The ruling class remained the same in structure, even though the individuals composing it might, and necessarily did, through death, marriage, ennoblement, and so on, change. Since the coercive institutions of the state, armed forces, court, etc., in feudal society enforced these rights, we may properly speak of the medieval state as a feudal state. To an ever-increasing extent in post-medieval society, the decisive sectors of economy are not agricultural, but mercantile, industrial, and financial. In modern society, the persons who control access to and receive preferential treatment in the distribution of the products of the instruments of production in these fields, and to a varying extent in the land also, are those whom we call capitalists. They constitute the class of the bourgeoisie. Their control is exercised in terms of the typical property rights recognized by modern society, with which we are all familiar. By our definition, the bourgeoisie or capitalists are the ruling class in modern society. Since the society recognizes these rights, we may properly speak of it as bourgeois or capitalist society. Since these rights have been enforced by the political institutions of modern society, by the state, we may speak similarly of the bourgeois or capitalist state. Once again, the existence of the bourgeois class does not depend upon the existence of any particular individuals. The individual members change. The existence of the class means only that there is in society a group exercising, in terms of these recognized bourgeois property institutions, a special degree of control over the access to the instruments of production and receiving as a group preferential treatment in the distribution of the products of these instruments. What, let us ask, would be the situation in a classless society, a society organized along socialist lines? For society to be classless would mean that within society there would be no group, with the exception perhaps of temporary delegate bodies, freely elected by the community and subject always to recall, which would exercise as a group any special degree of control over access to the instruments of production, and no group receiving as a group preferential treatment in distribution. Somewhat more strictly, on the latter point, there would be no group receiving, by virtue of special economic or social relations, preferential treatment in distribution. Preferential treatment might be given to certain individuals on the basis of some non-economic factor. For instance, ill persons might receive more medical aid than healthy persons. Men doing heavy physical work, more food than children or those with sedentary occupations, without violating economic classlessness. A new class rule in society would, in contrast, mean that society would become organized in such a way that a new group, defined in terms of economic and social relations differing from both feudal relations and bourgeois relations, would, as a group, in relation to the rest of the community, exercise a special degree of control over access to the instruments of production and receive preferential treatment in the distribution of the products of those instruments. As a matter of fact, the transformation of the state institutions into integral parts of a capitalist society was a lengthy and complicated process, sometimes, but not always, including bitter civil wars as decisive steps. In the 15th and 16th and even the 17th centuries, the early capitalists, we know from the records of those times, worked closely with the princes or kings. The king in feudal society had been relatively unimportant, one feudal lord among others, often with less actual power than his chief vassals. When the kings began to strengthen their central authority and to try to build nations in the modern sense, their most obvious enemies were the feudal lords, including feudal lords who were supposed to be their own vassals. A sort of analogy today might be the fact that government officials do not wield the kind of power that absolute monarchists are wielding, right? They have more powerful vassals as well, if we think of corporations in monopoly capitalism as vassals, as analogous to vassals. The kings sought support from the capitalists. The capitalists gave support to the kings because they too wanted stronger relations with national armies and navies to protect trade routes and uniform laws, currencies, and taxes so that trade could be carried on without constant interruption from 100 feudal barons who considered themselves independent lords. Because they made huge sums of money from dealing with the princes, and because they exacted protection and privileges in return for the aid they gave. In the wars and peace treaties, the elections of popes and emperors, the voyages of explorers and conquering armies during the 16th century, we always find a most prominent part played by the money of the Fugger, or Medici, or Welser, or the other great merchant bankers of Augsburg, or Antwerp, or Lyons, or Genoa. Hope I'm saying it right. But the princes, too, could not be trusted in business matters, as many of these same great 16th century capitalists found to their bankruptcy and ruin. The de facto alliance between prince and capitalists was dissolved, and the prince was ousted, made a figurehead, or at the least restricted in the area of society over which his power extended. There were more wars and revolutions, and the ideal bourgeois state of the late 18th and 19th centuries emerged. Political power vested in the lower house of a parliament with full assurance that the parliament was, by constitution, law, habit, custom, and belief, dedicated to the upholding of the structure of rights and obligations in terms of which society is organized as capitalist. One last observation in connection with the struggle for power of the bourgeoisie. Where did the early capitalists come from? They came from several sections of society. Adventurers and brigands turned easily into capitalists after success in some escapade. Artisans or master craftsmen became capitalists when they began to hire workers for wages. The biggest capitalists of the early period came from the ranks of the merchant shippers who were, as we saw, a special group even in the Middle Ages proper. The point I wish to note is that in some, not a few, cases, the capitalists came from the ranks of the old ruling class, from among the feudal lords themselves. Many of the feudal lords were killed off in the various wars. The family lines of many others died out or sank into impoverished obscurity. But some of them turned themselves into capitalists. By driving the serfs off their land and engaging in agricultural and capitalist landlords, or as capitalist landlords, by undertaking the capitalist exploitation of mines on their land, or by using capitalist ventures gold or jewels or money that they had acquired. We must remember for the future also that for a ruling class to be eliminated from society in favor of another ruling class does not mean that all of its individual members and their families disappear. Some of them may be found, perhaps prominently found, economically and socially metamorphized in the ranks of the new ruling class. In describing the character of the present social transition and the new type of society which is now developing, I shall continue to use the language of the struggle for power. I shall speak of the class of managers as fighting for power, in particular for state power as having and propagating typical ideologies, and I shall speak of the managerial state and managerial society. I shall use this language because it is easy, well-known, and picturesque. But its metaphorical significance must not be overlooked. It covers social processes of the greatest complexity, which I shall assume, as we always assume when we try to learn from experience, are not too dissimilar in general form to those of the struggle for power conducted by the bourgeoisie, which I have sketchily touched on in this chapter. This whole last section was really a grand embellishment of his epistemological approach. He's trying to show you that he is being scientific, that this is not some conspiracy theory, that he's not using these metaphorical words lightly, that he is basing them in how they do and do not relate to actual situations, and he's trying to be critical while doing all of that. And I think it's worth taking that seriously. I think it's worth reading that over, and I don't know, I could totally see the excerpt not including that, but at the same time, if you don't read that part and then you just read this next part without those preliminary things, then it might be easy to dismiss him, right? And the one thing I want is that he's not just routinely or easily dismissed. I want this to be something that is tarried with, in the sense of tarrying with the negative, working through the contradiction, not just running away, waving our hands, saying, oh, whatever, right? Marx would take this seriously. If Marx was born today, what would he do? He would read everything that is a fundamental critique of what he thought would happen, and he would develop a new theory based in the changing situation. And so any theory that's going to work with the actual situation we're in has to think through, okay, what was the theory before? What are ways that it's wrong and ways it can be corrected? And what are some of the points that have truth to them but have been hard to integrate for existing movements? Okay, those would be the important questions, I would imagine. The theory of the managerial revolution. We are now in a position to state in a preliminary way the theory of the managerial revolution, the theory which provides the answer to our central problem. The theory holds, to begin with, that we are now in a period of social transition in the sense which has been explained, a period characterized, that is, by an unusually rapid rate of change of the most important economic, social, political, and cultural institutions of society. This transition is from the type of society which we have called capitalist or bourgeois to a type of society which we shall call managerial. This transition period may be expected to be short compared with the transition from feudal to capitalist society. It may be dated somewhat arbitrarily from the First World War and may be expected to close with the consolidation of the new type of society by approximately 50 years from then, perhaps sooner. I shall now use the language of the struggle for power to outline the remaining key assertions of the theory. What is occurring in this transition is a drive for social dominance, for power and privilege, for the position of ruling class by the social group or class of the managers, as I shall call them, reserving for the moment an explanation of whom this class includes. This drive will be successful. At the conclusion of the transition period, the managers will, in fact, have achieved social dominance, will be the ruling class in society. This drive, moreover, is worldwide in extent, already well advanced in all nations, though at different levels of development in different nations. The economic framework in which the social dominance of the managers will be assured is based upon the state ownership of the major instruments of production. Within this framework, there will be no direct property rights in the major instruments of production vested in individuals as individuals. I want to point out that though we can say that the managerial revolution did not take place within 50 years, and people still can be found who are indeed capitalists, who have vested power as individuals over means of production, they can be found. The general situation, though, is corporate ownership, which is by definition not ownership of the means of production by individuals. Like an example of a capitalist, like Ron McIntyre, I think is the name of a former boss in Hayden, Idaho. The dude owns like probably 20 grocery stores, right? And he has like a small dynasty, like his children are in positions of power in all these different grocery stores. And then it's a Mormon family and it's a big family and they own these outright. Okay. That's a capitalist for sure. Another example might be, I can't actually say his name, but a friend of mine works at a place and it is a warehouse, and the capitalist owner comes around all the time and has them all carry out tasks that while they're on the clock are just personally benefiting him. Like, oh, deliver this crate of water bottles to my house. Take toilet paper to my house. Like, he is an individual capitalist who owns this operation, and he's always around micromanaging and ordering people around like he's the boss. He is the boss, but he's not the manager, but he still comes around, oversees the process, etc. So, I mean, these are examples of actually existing capitalists who are individual owners. But yeah, my point is just that corporate ownership is a lot more predominant, especially at the bigger level, How then, it will be at once asked, and this is the key to the whole problem, if that is the economic framework, will the existence of a ruling class be possible? A ruling class, we have seen, means a group of persons who, by virtue of special social economic relations, exercises a special degree of control over access to the instruments of production and receives preferential treatment in the distribution of the product of these instruments. Capitalists were such a group precisely because they, as individuals, held property rights in the instruments of production. If in managerial society no individuals are to hold comparable property rights, how can any group of individuals constitute a ruling class? The answer is comparatively simple and, as already noted, not without historical analogs. The manager will exercise their control over the instruments of production and gain preference in the distribution of the products, not directly through property rights vested in them as individuals, but indirectly through their control of the state, which in turn will own and control the instruments of production. The state, that is, the institutions which comprise the state, will, if we wish to put it that way, be the property of the managers, and that will be quite enough to place them in the position of ruling class. The control of the state by the managers will be suitably guaranteed by appropriate political institutions, analogs to the guarantee of bourgeois dominance under capitalism by the bourgeois political institutions. The ideologies expressing the social role and interests and aspirations of the managers, like the great ideologies of the past as an indispensable part of the struggle for power, have not yet been fully worked out, any more than were the bourgeois ideologies in the period of transition to capitalism, right? The point is like the ideology, it's never like all worked out in advance. John Stuart Mill or John Locke, they didn't just sit there with a pen and write out the full ideology of the bourgeois revolution and then hand it over. And then the bourgeoisie was like, looks good to us. And then, no, it doesn't work that way. Okay. There are people on the ground, intellectuals usually, trying to find a way of communicating and articulating the feelings people have, the concerns that people have, and bringing that into relation with and rationalizing the overarching tendency of the social situation. They are already approximated, however, from several different but similar directions by, for example, Leninism, Stalinism, fascism, Nazism, and at a more primitive level by New Dealism and such less influential American ideologies as technocracy. This, then, is the skeleton of the theory, expressed in the language of the struggle for power. It will be observed that the separate assertions were designed to cover the central phases involved in a social transition and in the characterization of type of society, which were discussed in Chapter 1 and in Chapters 1 and 2. Is in this Chapter 1? But we must now remember that the language of the struggle for power is metaphorical. No more than in the case of the capitalists have the managers or their representatives ever got together to decide, deliberately and explicitly, that they were going to make a bid for world power. Nor will the bulk of those who have done and will do the fighting in the struggle be recruited from the ranks of the managers themselves. Most of the fighters will be workers and youths, who will doubtless many of them believe that they are fighting for ends of their own, or democracy for that matter. Nor have the managers themselves been constructing and propagating their own ideologies. This has been and is being done for the most part by intellectuals, writers, philosophers. Most of these intellectuals are not in the least aware that the net social effects of the ideologies which they elaborate contributes to the pomp and privilege of the managers and to the building of a new structure of class society in society. As in the past, the intellectuals believe that they are speaking in the name of truth and for the interests of all humanity. John Rawls and John Maynard Keynes are a couple of really good examples of liberal theorists who had some socialistic feelings that were interested in a kinder managerial control. In short, the question whether the managers are conscious and critical, whether they, or some of them, set before themselves the goal of social dominance and take deliberate steps to reach that goal, this question, in spite of what seems to be implied by the language of the struggle for power, is not really at issue. In simplest terms, the theory of the managerial revolution asserts merely the following. Modern society has been organized through a certain set of major economic, social, and political institutions, which we call capitalist, and has exhibited certain major social beliefs or ideologies. Within this social structure, we find that a particular group or class of persons, the capitalists or bourgeoisie, is the dominant or ruling class in the sense which has been defined. At the present time, these institutions and beliefs are undergoing a process of rapid transformation. The conclusion of this period of transformation, to be expected in the comparatively near future, will find society organized through a quite different set of major economic, social, and political institutions and exhibiting quite different major social beliefs or ideologies. Within the new social structure, a different social group or class, the managers, will be the dominant or ruling class. If we put the theory in this latter way, we avoid the possible ambiguities of the overly picturesque language of the struggle for power metaphor. Nevertheless, just as in the case of the bourgeois revolution against feudalism, human beings are concerned in this social transformation. And in particular, the role of the ruling class to be is by no means passive. Just what part and how deliberate a part they play, as well as the part of other persons in classes, bourgeois, proletarian, farmer, and the like, is a matter for specific inquiry. What they intend and want to do does not necessarily correspond with the actual events of what they do, say, and do. Though we are primarily concerned with the actual effects, which will constitute the transformation of society to a managerial structure, we are also interested in what the various groups say and do. These remarks are necessary if we are to avoid common misunderstandings. Human beings, as individuals and in groups, try to achieve various goals: food, power, comfort, peace, privilege, security, freedom, and so on. They take steps which, as they see them, will aid in reaching the goal in question. Experience teaches us not merely that the goals are often not reached, but that the effect of the steps taken is frequently toward a very different result from the goal which was originally held in mind and which motivated the taking of the steps in the first place. As Machiavelli pointed out in his History of Florence, the poor, enduring oppressive conditions, were always ready to answer the call for a fight for freedom, but the net result of each revolt was merely to establish a new tyranny. Many of the early capitalists sincerely fought for the freedom of individual conscience in relation to God, and what they got as a result of the fighting was often a harsh and barren fundamentalism in theology, but at the same time political power and economic privilege for themselves. So today we want to know what various persons and groups are thinking and doing, and what they are thinking and doing has its effects on historical processes. But there is no obvious correspondence between the thoughts and the effects, and our central problem is to discover what the effects in terms of social structure will be. It should be noted, and it will be seen in some detail, that the theory of the managerial revolution is not merely predicting what may happen in a hypothetical future. The theory is, to begin with, an interpretation of what already has happened and is now happening. Its prediction is simply that the process which has started and which has already gone a very great distance will continue and reach completion. The managerial revolution is not just around the corner, that corner which seems never quite to be reached. The corner of the managerial revolution was turned some while ago. The revolution itself is not something we or our children have to wait for. We may, if we wish, observe its stages before our eyes. Just as we seldom realize that we are growing old until we are already old, so do the contemporary actors in the major social change seldom realize that society is changing until the change has already come. The old words and beliefs persist long after the social reality that gave them life has dried up. Our wisdom in social questions is almost always retrospective only. This is, or ought to be, a humiliating experience for human beings. If justice is beyond us, we would like at least to claim knowledge. And then this might be the most important section. I think the last section and this section are probably the two most important. And I will probably want to spend the most time taking these two sections and bringing them down to a half-hour reading excerpt. Who are the managers? I like that he said that we can see it if we choose to see it, right? Like it's happening right before our eyes, and it can happen if we choose to see it. I think the importance of saying that is it's tied into what he was saying earlier about Stalinism. Like, you can see the problems with it for yourself if you care to see it, right? Like, but if you are just resolutely committed to defending, you're never going to see it. In the same way, if you are resolutely committed to a theory for making sense of society that was developed 150 years ago, it's very possible that you'll only see similarities, and that the data of experience will always confirm your preconceived concepts, right? The point is, and this is the dialectical point, to take on different theories and perspectives so that you can free the phenomena from an overdetermined, prefigured interpretation and wrest it from that feeling of sort of natural confirmation. Who are the managers? We must now clear up a question, the answer to which has so far been postponed. Who are these managers, the class which is in the process of becoming the ruling class of society? The answer which interests us will not be given in terms of individuals. That is, we do not want to know that Mr. X, Miss Y, and other separate persons are managers. The answer that we need will be, first of all, in terms of function. By virtue of what function is it that we shall designate an individual as a manager? Whoever the individual may be, now or in the future, how are we to decide whether or not he is a manager? The functions that are of initial and prime importance to us are, of course, those functions in relation to the major instruments of production, since it is the relation to the instruments of production which decides the issue of class dominance of power and privilege in society. The first part of the answer might seem to be only a verbal juggle and of no more value than any other verbal juggle. The managers are simply those who are, in fact, managing the instruments of production nowadays. Certainly saying this does not appreciably advance our understanding. We must therefore investigate more carefully to see just who is doing the managing, and in the investigation, we shall have to analyze out several ideas which are confusedly grouped together under the concept of management. It would seem obvious that in capitalist society, it would be the capitalists who, in decisive respects at least, do the managing. If they do not manage the instruments of production, how could they maintain their position as ruling class, which depends upon control over the instruments of production? This is obvious, and the answer to this question is that they could not. It is the fact that during the past several decades, the de facto management of the instruments of production has, to a constantly increasing extent, got out of the hands of the capitalists, that so plainly proves society to be shifting away from capitalism and the capitalists losing their status as the ruling class. In ever-widening sectors of world economy, the actual managers are not the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, or at the very least, the managerial prerogatives of the capitalists are being progressively whittled down. The completion of this process means the elimination of the capitalists from control over the economy, that is, their disappearance as a ruling class. Let us make some distinctions. It is unnecessary to stress that the most important branches of modern industry are highly complex in technical organization. The tools, machines, and procedures involved are the results of highly developed scientific and technical operations. The division of labor is minute and myriad. The turning out of the final product is possible only through the technical coordination of a vast number of separate tasks, not only within the individual factory, but in mines, farms, railroads, steamships, affiliated processors, and the like. If we continue to look purely at the technical side of the process, we may observe the following. In comparison with the organization of industry in the period prior to modern mass production, the individual tasks, with the notable exception of a comparatively small percentage, require relatively less skill and training on the part of the individual worker. A century ago, it took many years and considerable native aptitude to make a skilled general mechanic of the kind who then made engines or buildings or carriages or tools or machines. Today, it takes a couple of weeks to make a worker ready to take his place on a production or assembly line. This de-skilling note is obviously so important also for Barbara Ehrenreich. Even so-called skilled work today usually needs no more than a few months' training. But conversely, at the same time, today, a small percentage of tasks requires very great training and skill. And Ehrenreich, she talked about how the progressives at the turn of the 20th century, with the Carnegie Institute, the Rockefeller Institute, with, what was the president's name? Woodrow Wilson, etc. Like the whole thing being rolled out at the time of Taylorism was to consolidate the skills into small monopolized positions that would require usually college to be able to acquire. And obviously, like to some degree, and part of the point is that it's not actually the knowledge gained through college, but the discipline administered on the person going into that position that matters, right? The point is to give that person a qualitatively different relationship to capitalism than the rest of the working class. So you take all the skills, you put them into positions, and then you have the people holding those positions go through a kind of training on the other side of which they won't see themselves as workers anymore. They'll see themselves as something else. They'll see themselves as the deserving, the enlightened, right? The technocratic knowledge havers that everyone else should just listen to and follow. He says, or let me put it in this way. Within the process of production, the gap estimated both in amount of skill and training and in difference of type of function between the average worker and those who are in charge on the technical side of the process of production is far greater today than in the past. From among those tasks which today require lengthy training and considerable skill, 3 may be separated out. One type is found widely in those industries which, like the building industry, have not yet been organized in accordance with modern methods. There is, however, no technical reason why this has not been done in such industries. If it were done, the relative number of highly skilled workers in, for example, building, would at once enormously decrease. Another type consists of those tasks which need elaborate training in the physical sciences and in engineering. These have greatly increased in recent decades. A century ago, there were scarcely any highly trained chemists, physicists, biochemists, or even engineers functioning directly in industry, a fact which is plainly witnessed by the almost complete lack of educational facilities for training such industrial scientists and engineers. The comparatively primitive techniques of those days did not require such persons. Today, few branches of industry could operate without their constant services. The third type consists of the tasks of the technical direction and coordination of the process of production. All the necessary workers, skilled and unskilled, and all the industrial scientists will not turn out automobiles. The diverse tasks must be organized, coordinated, so that the different materials, tools, machines, plants, workers are all available at the proper place and moment and in the proper numbers. This task of direction and coordination is itself a highly specialized function. Often it also requires acquaintance with the physical sciences or the psychological and social sciences, since human beings are not the least among the instruments of production, and with engineering. But it is a mistake, which was made by Veblen, among others, to confuse this directing and coordinating function with the scientific and engineering work which I have listed under the second type of task. After all, the engineers and scientists of the second type are merely highly skilled workers, no different in kind from the worker whose developed skill enables him to make a precision tool or operate an ingenious lathe. They have no functions of guiding, administering, managing, organizing the process of production, which tasks are the distinctive mark of the third type. For these tasks, engineering and scientific knowledge may be, though it is not always, or necessarily, a qualification, but the tasks themselves are not engineering or science in the usual sense. It is this third type of function which, in the fullest and clearest meaning, I call managing, and those who carry out this type of function are they whom I call the managers. Many different names are given them. We may often recognize there as production managers, operating executives, superintendents, administrative engineers, supervisory technicians, or in government, for they are to be found in governmental enterprise just as in private enterprise, as administrators, commissioners, bureau heads, and so on. I mean by managers, in short, those who already, for the most part, in contemporary society are actually managing, on its technical side, the actual process of production, no matter what the legal and financial form, individual, corporate, governmental, of the process. There are, to be sure, gradations among the managers. Under the chief operating executives of a corporation like General Motors or U.S. Steel, or a state enterprise like the TVA, there are dozens and hundreds of lesser managers, a whole hierarchy of them. In its broader sense, the class of managers includes them all. Within the class, there are the lesser and the greater. But it may well be commented, there is nothing new in the existence of managers. Industry has always had to have managers. Why do they suddenly become this peculiar importance? Let us examine this comment. In the first place, industry did not always require managers. At the very least, not at all in the sense that we find them today. In feudal times, the individual serf and his family tilled the small plot of soil to which he was attached. The individual artisan with his own tools turned out his finished product. No manager intervened to regulate and organize the process of production. Managers entered in only to the negligible sector of economy where larger-scale enterprise was employed. Even in earlier capitalist times, the function of technical management was not crucial. The process of production was so simple, the division of labor so little developed compared to today, that hardly any special skill and training were necessary to carry out the functions of management. He's not going to bring in Taylorism, I don't think, as a direct response to working class organizations. So hats off to Barbara Ehrenreich for making it a lot more concrete in that sense, right? Because the point of Taylorism is to wrest control from the workers and to preempt working class organization by creating not just an artificial monopoly on certain skills vested into the PMC, but also by developing, by preempting class struggle through various methods of constructing class conciliation. Okay. I don't think he really touches on that element, and it's a very important element. But I mean, that's kind of why this goes together so well with her essay, right? Like the two obviously complement each other a lot, even though, of course, she hates Burnham. She does not like him. She mainly hates him by neglecting to talk about him, except there is the chapter in Fear of Falling where she kind of goes after right-wing populists using the term PMC or something akin to it. And I think she touches on Burnham there, but her bigger concern is the way that it gets used by neoconservatism after Burnham. Burnham might have been the first and last intelligent, Marx-based neocon, you know? And it's easy to see that just because if you're not in Marxism or you don't take Marxism seriously or you've not been seeing the world through a Marxist lens, then why would you really care about this book, right? Like, obviously, like your average conservative isn't going to really care. This is something that it probably has, I think it probably just only has importance to people who have a background in Marxism at this point. Nearly anyone who had any reasonable acquaintance with the industry in question could handle it. Equally decisive for our purpose is the differentiation in who does the managing, what prerogatives attach to management, and how the functions of management are related to other economic and social functions. In the earlier days of capitalism, the typical capitalist, the ideal of the ideologists before and after Adam Smith, was himself his own manager, so far as there were managerial functions other than those assigned to some reliable, skilled worker in the shop. Ford is like kind of the key, like the perfect example there. He was the individual entrepreneur who owned the whole or the greater share of the factory or mine or shop or steamship company or whatever it might be, and actively managed his own enterprise, perhaps to retire in old age in favor of management by his heirs. But as is well known, the growth of large-scale public corporations along with the technological development of modern industry have virtually wiped such types of enterprise out of the important sections of the economy. With a few exceptions, they remain only among the small businesses, which are trivial in their historical influence. Those changes have meant that, to an ever-growing extent, the managers are no longer, either as individuals or legally or historically, the same as the capitalists. There is a combined shift. Through changes in the technique of production, the functions of management become more distinctive, more complex, more specialized, and more crucial to the whole process of production, thus serving to set off those who perform these functions as a separate group or class in society, and at the same time, those who formerly carried out what functions there were of management, the bourgeoisie, themselves withdraw from management, so that the difference in function becomes also a difference in the individuals who carry out the function. Something he did not preempt was neoliberalism, which starts in the 1950s. So right around the time that this book is released, intellectuals start organizing around the idea of, okay, what we need is class conciliation between the PMC and the capitalists. And so right-wing and left-wing forms of neoliberalism develop over the course of the next 30 years, and then they really take hold in the 80s and 90s. Because neoliberalism is seeing a lot of contradictions, we might see a lot more PMC people start reverting to a more social democratic kind of rhetoric and forms of policy, right? Because neoliberalism versus social democracy are both, in a way, they're both ways for the PMC to sell us on different versions of capitalism. Let us take a hypothetical and oversimplified example in order to make more precise what is meant by management and to separate this off from other ideas which are often grouped with it. We will let our example be an imaginary automobile company. In connection with the ownership, control, and management situation in relation to this company, we may distinguish the following groups. Certain individuals, the operating executives, production managers, plant superintendents, and their associates, have charge of the actual technical process of producing. It is their job to organize the materials, tools, machines, plant facilities, equipment, and labor in such a way as to turn out the automobiles. These are the individuals whom I call the managers. It should be observed that the area of production which any group of them manages is most variable. It may be a single small factory or mine or a single department within a factory. Or it may be a large number of factories, mines, railroads, and so on, as in the case of the chief managers of the great United States corporations. In theory, the area could be extended to cover an entire interrelated branch of industry, automobiles, mines, utilities, railroads, whatever it might be, or most, or even all, of the entire mechanism of production. In practice, in the United States at present, however, there do not exist managers in this sense for whole branches of industry, with possibly one or two exceptions, much less for a major portion or all of industry as a whole. The organization and coordination of industry as a whole is carried on through the instrumentality of the market, without deliberate and explicit management exercised by specific managers or indeed by anyone else. Certain individuals, among whom in the United States at present would ordinarily be found the highest ranked and best paid of the company officials, have the functions of guiding the company toward a profit, of selling the automobiles at a price and in the most suitable numbers for yielding a profit, of bargaining over prices paid for raw materials and labor, of arranging the terms of the financing of the company, and so on. These functions are often also called those of management, and those who fulfill them, managers. However, there is clearly no necessary connection between them and the first type of function. From the point of view of the technical process of production, a car would be neither worse nor better because of what it's sold for. It could be given away and still be the same car, technically speaking, or what the materials which went into it cost, nor so far as technical problems go, does the difference between bank loans at 4% or 5% show up in the power of the motor, or a change in dividend rate alter the strength of the frame. In order to distinguish this group from the first, I shall call the individuals who make it up finance executives, or simply executives, reserving the terms management and managers for the first group only. Finally, there are certain individuals, a comparatively large number as a rule in the United States at present, who own in their names stock certificates in the automobile company and who are formally and legally the owners of our company. In fact, however, the great bulk of them, comprising in sum the legal owners of the substantial majority of the stock of the company, have an entirely passive relation to the company. The only right they possess with reference to the company is to receive, as against those who do not have stock certificates registered in their names, money in the form of dividends, which on occasion dividends are declared by the directors. This fourfold separation into managers, executives, finance capitalists, and stockholders is, in reality, a separation of function, of four of the types of relation in which it is possible to stand toward a certain section of the instruments of production. It is theoretically possible, therefore, that one and the same individual, or one and the same group of individuals, should perform all four of these functions, should stand in all four of these relations to the instruments of production in question. In our hypothetical case, the tangible assets of the automobile company. That is, one and the same individual, Henry Ford, as for some years ago was a late and favorite example, or group of individuals could manage the production of the company, direct its policies so as to make a profit, integrate its activities in relation to banks and to other companies, if such were in question, and be the sole stockholder of the company. Not only is such an identity possible, until comparatively recently, it was normally the case. Today, however, it is very seldom the case, especially in the more important sections of industry. The four functions are much more sharply differentiated than in the past, and they are, as a rule, performed by different sets of persons. It is not always so, of course, but it tends to become more and more so. Even where there is overlapping, where the same individual performs several of these functions, his activities in pursuit of these are easily separable. Like, I would like to know how many of the billionaires that we know of by name today are a combination of those, right? I would like to I think there's over 1,000 billionaires today. I would love to see to what degree they might fill these different functions, right? Like, for instance, Elon Musk is an executive. Is he also a finance capitalist who has to move money from one operation to another and have to make those yeah, to some degree. But he also works for stockholders. Is he also a stockholder that has like this passive relation of collecting dividends from other companies that we don't even hear about? I don't know. I would like to know. Two further facts about these groups may be noted. In most large corporations, which together are decisive in the economy, the bulk of the stockholders holding in their names the majority of the shares of stock have, as everyone knows, the passive relation to the company which has been referred to. With only the rarest exceptions, they exercise no real control over the company, except for the minor element of control involved in their preferential sharing in the profits, or rather the declared dividends of the company. But the third group in our list, the finance capitalists, are also, some of them at any rate, stockholders. Together, they usually do not own, in the legal sense, a majority of the shares, but they ordinarily own a substantial block of the shares and have at their disposal liquid funds and other resources whereby they can, when need arises, obtain from the small stockholders enough proxies on stock shares to be able to vote a majority. Thus, this third group is in a legal position of ownership toward the company and the instruments of production included among the company's assets. If not with the unambiguous title of an earlier capitalist who in his own name owned all, or a majority of, the shares of a company, at least to a sufficient degree to preserve the meaning of the legal relationship. Sometimes the executives of Group 2 are also included in Group 4 and have substantial legal interests of ownership in the company, that is, have registered in their own or their family's names substantial blocks of the company's stock. But this is very seldom the case with the managers proper, with the members of Group 1. These ordinarily have no legal ownership interest in the company, or at most a very small interest. That is, they are not usually large stockholders in the company. Second, there is a complete difference among these groups with respect to the technical role of their respective functions in relation to the process of production. The process of production is technically and literally impossible unless someone is carrying out the functions of management of Group 1. Not necessarily the same individuals who carry them out today, but at any rate, someone. Some of the finance executive functions comprised in Group 2 are also technically necessary to the process of production, though not necessarily in the same sense as today. That is, not necessarily for the sake of profit as understood by capitalism. There must be some regulation of the quality, kinds, numbers, and distribution of products apart from the theoretic abilities of the instruments of production to turn products out. The regulation would not have to be achieved, however, as it is through the finance executives in terms of capitalist profits for the company. It could be done in subordination to some political or social or psychological aim, war or a higher standard of mass living or prestige and glory or the maintenance of some particular power relationship. In fact, with profit in the capitalist sense eliminated, the technically necessary functions of the finance executives of Group 2 become part of the management functions of Group 1, if management is extended over all or most of industry. Management could, that is to say, absorb all of the technically necessary functions of the non-managing executives. But still, from a strictly technical viewpoint, the remaining functions, the profit-making functions of Group 2 and all the functions of Groups 3 and 4, finance, capitalist, and stockholder, are altogether unnecessary. whether or not desirable from some other point of view, to the process of production. So far as the technical process of production goes, there need not be finance capitalists or stockholders, and the executives of Group 2, stripped of many of their present functions, can be merged in the management of Group 1. Not only is this development conceivable, it has already been almost entirely achieved in Russia, is approached more and more nearly in Germany, and has gone a considerable distance in other nations. In the United States, as everywhere, it is precisely the situation to be found throughout state enterprise. Okay, so that's a lot of Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, Group 4. Okay, so the basic point, though, is that the shareholders and the finance executives are a kind of dead weight. Okay, you might be a manager at a factory, and then the finance executives decide, oh, we're going to switch things up. We're closing you down. And that manager there is fucked. Okay. So, in a sort of sense, the capitalists can be seen as a parasitic and extra non-essential element of the process of production. And the managers can have an antagonism to them. Okay. The basic power struggle between the managers and the finance executives is one that plays out every day in a variety of contexts. And he thinks the tendency is going to result in, as capitalist crises compound, as profitability crises constantly close down factories that are actually producing things that people want or need, eventually managerial society control will step in to say, all right, doing everything for the profit motive is ridiculous. We don't want that. Okay. Well, wouldn't that just be socialism then? Not if they don't care about more equitable distribution of the goods and access to the, from the goods of these means of production. Not if they have no interest in eliminating the bullshit jobs and the shitty jobs that can't be automated, right? That's my major concern, obviously, is that just because managerial control over the economy might wrest control from the finance executives doesn't mean that those people doing so, say pushing for a more socially democratic configuration of society, doesn't mean that they will actually have any interest in freeing up time and energy for regular working people. Doesn't mean that they'll actually have any interest in people having better living conditions in general across the society, right? And insofar as they see themselves as a part of an elite, deserving class that is in its position because they did good in school and everyone else, well, sucks to suck. Insofar as that sort of technocratic elitism is cooked into it as a class, we can definitely expect that these more equitable changes are not going to come unless there's some kind of a change in consciousness, in ideology, and in the antagonism between these classes. So whenever people say, well, we can't hate the PMC, we need to work with the PMC to push towards a socialist society, it's like, yeah, quite possibly true. But which sections? Would it be the sections that say, oh, we're just workers like everyone else, while obviously still fighting for and centering the interests of their own class? I don't think so. Would it come from people in the PMC who are like, oh, I've taken this all for granted, but I actually need to do things for the broader working class? Yeah, it would. It would probably require that. And that's not the kind of thing that Burnham's going to say. Okay, Burnham doesn't lay out proposals for ways of moving forward, right? That would be more like Barbara Ehrenreich. She would say that. She would see that as necessary. This development is a decisive phase of the managerial revolution. The so-called separation of ownership and control, paralleling the growth of the great public corporations of modern times, has, of course, been a widely recognized phenomenon. A decade ago, it was the principal subject of the widely read book, The Modern Corporation and Private Property, by Burl and Means. In this book, the authors showed that the economy of the United States was dominated by the 200 largest non-banking corporations. They did not discuss the relations of these to financial houses. And second, that the majority of these corporations were no longer, in practice, controlled by their nominal legal owners, that is, stockholders holding in their names a majority of the shares of stock. They divided these corporations according to types of control. In a few, control was exercised by a single individual, more often single family, who is legal owner of all or a majority of the stock, and others by individuals or groups which owned not a majority but a substantial percentage of the stock. Most, however, in 1929, 65% of these 200 corporations with 80% of the total assets, they decided were what they called significantly enough management controlled. By management controlled, as they explained, they meant that the management executives of these companies, though owning only minor percentages of the shares of their corporations, were in actuality self-perpetuating, in control of the policies and the boards of directors and the companies, and able to manipulate at will, through proxies, majority votes of the nominal owners, the shareholders. The result of this situation might be expected to be a merging of the conflict among the four groups and a common front against the presses of the masses. This has indeed often been the case. I mean, in a sort of sense, neoliberalism might be argued to be that, right? A common front of these ruling class people against the presses of the masses. Nevertheless, the conflicts among the groups are real and cannot be eliminated even in the face of a common danger. In fact, the presence of the common danger is itself a source of new conflicts. This follows because the groups, from the very status they occupy and functions they fulfill, favor different methods of meeting the danger and of maintaining privilege as against the masses. The differences become sharpened under the crisis conditions of contemporary capitalism. This can be made clear by a single example. Okay, what's your example, Burnham? The position, role, and function of the managers are in no way dependent upon the maintenance of capitalist property and economic relations, even if many of the managers themselves think so. They depend upon the technical nature of the process of modern production. Consequently, the preservation of the capitalist relations is not an absolutely decisive question for the managers. The position, role, and function of the most privileged of the groups, the finance capitalists, are, however, entirely bound up with the capitalist property and economic relations, and their preservation is decisive for even the continued existence of this group. This holds in general and cannot help affecting the situation with respect to more specific problems. This is all building up to something that it will detonate as something that mind blows you, not just once, but like repeatedly, like over the course of the next year. So brace yourself. For instance, from the point of view of the technical position of the managers, the problem of unemployment is perfectly easy to solve. If the technical coordination and integration of industry were extended, unemployment could be wiped out in a month. Just think of IMT as a perfect example of a PMC ideology that says, we don't have to have unemployment. We're wasting so much human time and energy. Why do we have people sitting around doing nothing? We could put those people to work. It would be so easy if these finance capitalists would just get out of our way and let us manage, right? It's IMT. Moreover, the managers, or many of them, are aware that unless mass unemployment is wiped out, all privileges, including their own, will be wiped out, either through national defeat by a nation which has wiped it out, or by internal chaos. But mass unemployment cannot be eliminated without invading and finally abolishing capitalist property and economic relations. The position of the managers thus forces them towards solutions which would have such an effect. But the finance capitalists, and even the executives for that matter, are differently situated. Their position, depending on the capitalist relations, thereby depends also on the continuance of mass unemployment. They cannot entertain any solution that has a chance of eliminating unemployment without involving at the same time their own elimination. If they think they can, they are simply mistaken, as they are beginning to find out in Germany and will before long find out elsewhere. A third source of conflict is found in what we might call occupational bias, a point to which we shall return later. The different things which these groups do promote in their respective members, different attitudes, habits of thought, ideals, ways, and methods of solving problems. To put it crudely, the managers tend to think of solving social and political problems as they coordinate and organize the actual process of production. The non-managerial executives think of society as a price-governed, profit-making animal. The finance capitalists think of problems in terms of what happens in banks and stock exchanges and security flotations. The little stockholders think of the economy as a mysterious god who, if placated properly, will hand out free gifts to the deserving. But there is a more basic deficiency in the analysis of Burrell and Means or any similar analysis. The truth is that whatever its legal merits, the concept of the separation of ownership and control has no sociological or historical meaning. Ownership means control. If there is no control, then there is no ownership. The central aspects of the control, which is ownership, are, as we have seen, control over access to the object in question and preferential treatment in the distribution of its products. If ownership and control are in reality separated, then ownership has changed hands to the control, and the separated ownership is a meaningless fiction. I mean, it's not completely meaningless because obviously the stockholders still get dividends every year, right? But the point is yeah, it's almost like they have some title, some privilege in society that gives them money on a regular basis, but the people doing the controlling ostensibly own it, right? Maybe not in law, but in function. This is perfectly obvious as soon as we think about it. If I own a house, let us say, that means that, at least under normal circumstances, I can prevent others from entering it. In developed societies with political institutions, it means also that the state, the police in this instance, backed by the courts, will, if necessary, enforce this control of mine over access to the house. If I cannot, when I wish to, prevent others from entering the house, if anyone else or everyone has the same right of entry as I, then neither I nor anyone else would say that I am the owner of the house, right? Like, oh, you're the owner of the house? Cool. Well, everyone else gets to do whatever they want here. Okay, well, then what does that even mean? I can, of course, alienate my control, either temporarily through a lease or permanently through sale or gift, but these and similar acts do not alter the fundamental point. Moreover, insofar as there are products of the house, warmth, shelter, privacy might be so considered, as well as rent, I, as owner, am, by the very fact of control over access in this case, entitled to preferential treatment in receiving these products. Where the object owned takes the form of instruments of production, factories, machines, mines, railroad, the situation is the same, only more complicated. For sociological and practical purposes, the owner or owners of the instruments of production is the one or group that in fact, whether or not in theory and words, controls access to those instruments and controls preferential treatment in the distribution of their products. These two rights, control of access and the preferential treatment in distribution, are fundamental in ownership and, as we have noted, determine the dominant or ruling class in society, which consists simply of the group that has those rights, or has them at least in greater measure than the rest of society with respect to the chief instruments of production. Moreover, historical experience shows that these two rights are interrelated and that the first, control of access, is determinative on the second. That is to say, the group or groups which have control over access to the instruments of production will, as a matter of experienced fact, also receive preference in the distribution of the products of those instruments. Or in other words, the most powerful, in terms of economic relations, will also be the wealthiest. This does not apply to every separate individual concerned, and there may be a temporary dislocation in the relationship, but to groups and over any period of time beyond a comparatively few years, it seems to apply always. Social groups and classes are, we might say, selfish. They use their control to benefit primarily themselves, though not necessarily exclusively. Burnham means are therefore inconsistent, or at least incomplete, when they speak of the separation of ownership and control. Those who control are the owners. The fact is that all four groups we have dealt with share at least to some degree in control, and at the least they all control preferential treatment in the distribution of the products of the instruments of production, which is enough to constitute them owners. Though in the case of the bulk of the stockholders, who have this control to a minor extent and none of the more decisive control over access, the ownership is of a very subordinate kind. But if we reinterpret the phrase separation of ownership and control to mean separation of control over access from control over preferential treatment in distribution, and this is partly what lies back of the Burnham means analysis, then we are confronted with a fact of primary importance. It is true that a partial separation of this kind has been taking place during recent decades. Income and power have become unbalanced. Those who receive the most preferential treatment in distribution, get the biggest relative share of the national income, have in differing degrees in different nations in different sections of the economy been losing control over access. Others who do not receive such a measure of in preferential treatment in distribution have been gaining in the measure of control over access which they exercise. Historical experience tells us that such a lack of correlation between the two kinds of control, the two basic rights of property, cannot long endure. Control over access is decisive, and when consolidated, will carry control over preferential treatment in distribution with it. That is, will shift ownership unambiguously to the new controlling, a new dominant class. Here we see, from a new viewpoint, the mechanism of managerial control. 1. I must warn that this fourfold division which I have made bears no relation to the usual division between industrial capitalists and finance capitalists. This latter distinction is of great importance in studying the historical development of capitalism, but seems to me of little value in the analysis of the structure of present-day capitalism. In particular, it is of no value in connection with the central problem of this book. Yeah, so it's managers, executives, finance capitalists, and shareholders, and each has its own relationship to others, but or its own interests, you know. So I think so the point, I said that there was this thing that's going to, like, once it sinks in, it's going to detonate and blow your mind for like years on end if you've taken the basic Marxian analysis to heart. And that is that you can have capitalism without capitalists. That's the thing. It's not inconceivable that there could be a capitalism that eliminates the finance capitalists and shareholders. If the profitability crises get so bad that neoliberalism is impossible, and the left and the right are both coming up with their own sort of social democrat approaches, or even just authoritarian seizures of control, the shareholders and finance capitalists could be abolished, and then their function is replaced by the state, but you're still going to have the managers and executives at every branch in industry. They're still going to be there. And then the market and the law of value and all of these other things that are typically what we think of when we think of capitalism get taken over, say, by algorithms, right? That doesn't mean that, or by state administrators, but that doesn't mean that the form of labor that the overwhelming massive majority of working class people are engaged in today would itself radically change, right? If we had kind and caring PMC and we're living in that kind of neo-feudal society, it's possible that there could be a more equitable distribution of commodities or the fruits of the production. But in terms of freeing up time and energy so that people are able to develop themselves and participate in the local community in a less alienated, less fragmented way, where the majority of your life is not dictated by helping some other person or group of people turn a profit, that's the concern for me, is that you could have a more equitable division or distribution of goods and resources without freeing up time and energy for people, and where people still see themselves as primarily workers and consumers. And that a PMC without self-consciousness and without any analysis of its interests as a class and the ideology that it's internalized isn't going to know the difference. They would be like Stalin saying, we've achieved it, comrades, we've achieved socialism, by which they just mean centralized control and everyone's still working. So, girl bosses, more diversity in the C-suite. What you saw here was a bunch of clips of excerpts from a couple of reading sessions that were done as a part of the Essential Texts live exegetical readings with Dave. Those are not live on YouTube, but they are done live on Zoom. And if you want to be able to participate, we'd love to have you. This is a quick little infomercial about what's being offered. Do you want to read, but you find that you're too distracted? Is that why you find yourself listening to things like this? Do you wish that you could focus in the mornings and have a more structured reading regimen so that you would be able to develop yourself to have a basis in a variety of fields, from political and social theory to continental philosophy and theory more broadly. Perhaps you find that while trying to do that, what's actually happening is you're constantly getting distracted or getting neurotically caught up in questioning whether you're even reading it correctly or not. And yeah, maybe you could benefit from having morning sessions with me. Every one of the courses being offered from Theory Underground is going to have an accompanied live exegetical reading component that you could attend in the mornings through Zoom calls. If you're someone who either has a lot of time on their hands and is playing video games, working out, skateboarding, or perhaps doing some kind of wage labor that allows you to listen to things, this is an opportunity to basically read these texts, but with a guide, someone who's already been over the territory before. This can drastically accelerate your own development, but also your own reading habits. Essential Texts with Dave in the Morning is something that I've been planning and developing for a while now, but I've only been doing it for a few weeks, and it's been a really good time. It's one of those things where I stop and have a side conversation to make sure that we've been making sense of the text up until that point, and then I'll summarize where we're at and then keep going. And that kind of interaction with other people while reading a text aloud takes it out of the isolation and sort of the self-referentiality and confusion of just doing things by yourself sometimes, especially if you are newer to texts like these. So I will be reading a variety of texts from political and social theory, as well as stuff like fundamental ontology with Martin Heidegger and Levinas and Das Kapital by Marx. So there's going to be a lot of different texts, kind of depending on what it is that we are doing in the courses. You don't have to sign up for the course to get access to Essential Texts with Dave. All you have to do is become a 1/10 of the cost of the means of production for Theory Underground patron, or a $50 a month patron. Either of those two tiers of patronage will get you access to the live exegetical readings of Essential Texts with me. On the other side, if you're not able to join these conversations live, you can pay for the backlog of all of my live exegetical readings, which are not publicly accessible. This video that you saw here was only the tip of the iceberg.